I'd like to do a little demo of the UltraLight using just an old ring model that I had kicking around. It's from a project from a number of years ago. Just zoom on in here and have a little look. Very simple setup, just a few pieces of geometry, a few lights and a camera. This is where I netted out when I did my first little test of it. Let's have a quick look at that. So nothing too crazy, fairly straightforward lighting, but a nice end result with some fairly sophisticated looking highlights and reflections. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to delete all these lights and start all over again and rebuild this. It probably won't be quite exactly the same when it's done, but we'll get somewhere in the same world and learn a little bit about the UltraLight and lighting in general along the way. Just added the geometry to a folder here just to keep it simple and clean things up a little bit. The lighting, I think what I'm going to do is just keep this light, and we'll just duplicate that and just drag it out of that folder, and we'll hide that. Just so I have a base light in there just to see what I'm doing. We can actually create a new folder here. Lighting version 2. Let's have a quick look at that light. It's just a fairly straightforward execution of the UltraLight with a little pattern in there. I believe the top box cool is actually built into the demo file. You can grab it from there if you want it. So it gives us just a general broad overlighting of the set. I originally threw it in just to sort of see where I was at, but as a baseline, it actually doesn't do a bad job of just providing an overall light for the scene. I think we definitely want to start adding some lights to highlight the ring itself, and then we'll deal with the background as well. So there are a few ways to kind of light and to play with the UltraLight, because it can feel a bit overwhelming and complicated at times. Lighting can be tricky, especially with shiny objects. This one isn't particularly challenging, but not so much as a car or something that has a lot more complex surfaces and materials and details that a potential client might wish to show. So for now, I'm just going to throw a box over top. And I'm just sort of looking in the camera view here. And again, I'm using Path Tracer, similar to the tutorial video. I generally use Path Tracer whenever I can. It's just the best result. Everything kind of looks better. You get much more realistic reflections and depth of field. So I'm just sort of looking in the path traced view to sort of see the shape of the highlight. You know, the ring itself has some interesting shapes to it. There's some carved braided sections here and just general rounded curves, and I'm looking for ways to highlight those and to bring out the broken surfaces as well as the ring surface itself, the polished surface. Maybe we'll start with something like that. Yeah, not bad. So I'm bringing out a little bit of shape in the top, bringing out some shape in this surface here. That's getting a little bit hot, but we can tone that down later. Certainly more things I want to add to it, but let's start with that. And we'll just play around with that shape just a little bit, see if we can get a little more on the front. Maybe just widen it out. I don't mind the fall off of light happening here on the edge of frame. It kind of adds a little natural vignetting. I'm just looking to see what else that's affecting. Watch these pieces here. It's a bit better when it's a little shorter. It's a little bit hot, so let's take that intensity down. And you know, this is all reflection. There is no actual light being cast now, so everything you're seeing is just a reflection. The only lighting that we're getting is from that overhead light. So we turn that off. We turn that one off. Oh, I ended up with two of these for some reason. Just keep one. Turn that one off. That's all the reflections. So there's no real light coming in from this one yet. And this is something I touched upon in the tutorial video. When you're lighting, particularly metallic objects, but anything that's got a shiny or reflective surface, a great deal of your lighting is positioning reflections. It's not actually about casting illumination. So your light source itself is less important than the shape and the surface of it, which is where the UltraLight becomes a really powerful lighting tool. Let's rename this one. Another thing with metallic surfaces, in particular things like gold, because what you're actually looking at here is a reflection of your light source in the surface, and if it's got a really polished surface, sometimes that reflection can obscure what the surface actually is or what the material is made out of. So a lot of times with things like gold, tinting the light and tinting the reflections, I'm going to just type color, will help tell the story of what the material is. So when you're lighting gold metal, sometimes you'll reflect gold reflectors or light sources into it. For example, just adding a bit more yellow to this light. And you can see it tints the reflections and gives it a lot more of a goldy feel overall. Maybe not quite that much, just a little bit. And just helps sell that surface and make it feel a little bit more gold-like to the viewer. Bring this back up a little bit. I am going to add a little bit of rec light. Let's just see what we get out of that. Let's turn off this one for a sec. Have to turn it on. It shouldn't take that much power. Yeah, that's not too bad for now. Now I definitely want to get in and start playing around with the lighting and the shape of those reflections and adding some more interest to the lights. There's different ways to approach your lighting. You can block everything out and then start refining. You can refine each light as you go. I don't have a fixed workflow. Sometimes I do one, sometimes do the other. In this case, what I'm going to do is leave the light as it is, get the general shape of the light, block it all out, and then we'll go back and start to polish these up a little bit. So we're definitely going to need more lights, and I can just grab this one because it has a few things already set on it that I like. The intensity, the colors have been added. So rather than create one from scratch, I'll just duplicate this light. Bring this one around. Now I'm looking at the sides of the ring in particular here. I'm just going to switch to global orientation. Sometimes that's a little easier to manage. And I'm looking at these surfaces here, and some, the inside face is trying to bring out some detail in there. Inside of the ring as well, here. One of the things with lighting something, particularly something shiny, but again, this applies to almost anything, is to just try your light all over the place and look around. You might have an idea of where you want those lights to be, but explore the chance for happy accidents to happen and just swing it all over the place. Try it bigger, try it smaller. Like there, I would not have thought of pushing it all the way back, but I really like the shape that's starting to bring out right here. Just those little hits on the corners. It's kind of nice, actually. Maybe it doesn't need a whole lot of light on that side. That might be enough. And it's in a weird place. This would be difficult to do in real life, but that's the advantage of 3D lighting. Play around with the shape of that a little bit. It's actually better like that. Speaking of shape, we can try one of the other shapes and just sort of see what that does to our highlight as well. Looking for the subtle changes that are happening in here. No, the box is better. I like that little curve that's happening here. So this one again can be toned a little bit down, I think, but let's look at the color first. Let's just add a little bit more intensity to this one. Yeah, not too shabby. Let's add one more. Let's try making this one quite a bit smaller. Toggling lights off and on, also very helpful to see what they're doing. Another useful tool is to generate light with one at a time, so you can see exactly what that light's doing, because sometimes the effect of one light can get lost in the existing lighting. And I don't really have a super tight plan. I'm just looking for ways to bring out the shape and the geometry and find something that kind of feels good to me. Let's see again with the other lights on. So I don't mind some of what that's doing for these faces here, but I don't love what's happening here or here. Find a better way to do that. Switch back to the local coordinates. And for this one, I think I will turn the rect light off. This one, I just want the reflections. Not bad. I think this one could use a shape change too. I use the filter quite a bit to find parameters faster. Okay, so let's start with that. I think right off the bat, we can look at all these lights and see how little shape there is in these reflections. They're in okay places, but they're so flat. And this is the common problem with CG lights, and one of the main reasons people use photographic light textures. But that only gets you so far. I do prefer to use shading as well as textures wherever possible. So let's start with this one with a radio. So the radio gradient, you can see when I type that in, you get the radio gradient. You'll see two of them. One's for the gobo, which we can ignore for now, and the other is for the light source itself. That's already feeling better. So again, let's look at that without and on. Have a look at this reflection on this piece here and here. So much better. And also just the amount of light that's falling in here is getting controlled. And we can get similar to that by toning down the intensity. Like if we look at that and then we take the intensity down in that one particular area, which is this surface here, we can start to tone it down. But you see it still feels flat. It's not the same result, and this side just looks blah. So if we undo that and go back to our radio. Another shortcut I like when I'm dealing with the gradients is to type in opacity. That gives me all of my opacities really fast. So when you're playing around with balancing the gradients against each other, this is a nice way to do it. And that feels a lot better. Now with that on, I think we can take the overall intensity back up again. And get a bit more brightness and pop out of that. Yeah. Not too bad. Let's have a look at that top light here. I should be renaming these. Should also save this every once in a while. I'm going to save this as a new version, which always resets the camera and turns back on the old lighting. We can turn off, and here we are. So the front round has a little bit of work done to it. The left side, I think we could probably do the same thing actually. Let's have a quick look at that. Yeah, definitely helps. I'll just type in radial to zero in on those. I think I want to avoid confusion. Let's see that. I find it helpful to see the light as I'm working on it. You can also overdrive the opacity in both directions, which gives you sort of an extra contrast control, which I use quite a bit. So let's just again try that off and on. So that's 0, 1.35, close enough. Yeah. Much better. I think we just need to bring the intensity back up again to balance that out. Nice. It's subtle, but I like what it's doing. And let's have a look at our top light. Also throw a radial on it. I use radial all the time. I just like that little sense of fog. Like that alone goes a mile. There's one, opacity of 0, and on. Off, on. It's night and day. Good. So one thing, this light here is giving us that, I believe it's the front round light, is giving us an extra hit here, which I think is actually helpful. Because this highlight up on the top is pretty flat. It's not giving us a lot of contrast. So having these extra kicks, these extra bright lights, give a lot more sense of specularity, a lot more shine to the surface, which is nice. So I think what's happening here is working pretty well, but I could use just a little more of a zing in there somewhere, something that's like super specular, bright white. So let's duplicate this one. Let's bring its intensity way up so I can really see what it's doing. Turn off everything else for the moment. Let's scale that down a little bit. Okay, let's say that works pretty well. So we're still getting a fairly hard-edged light there, a reflection. And right now it's behind the other light, so we're not seeing much of anything. So here's an example where I had it in a nice place, but this other light, which was off at the time, is in the way. And I do like what that light's doing, and I want this light to continue doing what it's doing. So this is where the additive function of these lights becomes very handy. So instead of using the opaque material, we're going to switch the original light to an additive material. And then we can hide the shell geometry. And now you can see that it's overlapping that light, but we can still see the little hot spot in behind it. And now it becomes visually like a single light source, like a little hot spot within that light, which I really like doing. So it adds a lot more interest to the light itself and creates a little more of a ping in various places around the shot. And if we wanted to make that softer edge, we certainly could. So right now it's just an additive material. And we could also use the alpha. So use composited as alpha. And this takes the combined effect of any texture maps, color, and gradients and ports it into the alpha to create some more opacity. Oh, it's on this light that I want that actually. This will only have effect on lights that are in the additive or transparent mode. It does not work on opaque materials, obviously. And it's a function that won't be available when you're using the deferred renderer and Lumen, because you cannot have transparent emissive materials in Lumen just yet. Another reason I like using the path tracer. But you can see now what we end up with is just this really soft, glowing hotspot. which starts to feel really nice. Switch back to global. I just want to play with that position a little bit now. So there's a few places that I feel like more love is and more attention is required. This piece is feeling a little dead, and this piece is still feeling a bit dead. So I think what I'll do is maybe to keep things simple, I'm just going to copy that additive light and bring it around the other side. Figure out where it needs to be. Yeah, somewhere back here. I know it's in the shot. We'll fix that after. I'm just looking at what's happening on this piece here. I quite like that little round highlight. Yeah. So it's in the shot a little bit, but I actually don't mind that. It's so out of focus back there, you don't even really see it, and I think I can probably rotate it away. It narrows this up a little bit, but that's actually not a bad thing either. Let's try that off and on. Yeah, nice. I think I'll add a little bit more gold to that one. Not what I meant. Again, naming. I'm very bad for this. So when it comes to coloring, I can definitely use the global tint and the base color. They will have a similar effect at this point. The difference is that the base color, everything is multiplied on top of that. And all the textures, the gradients, everything, each have their own color, and they all multiply on top of the base color and the texture. So your fundamental color is the base color. Textures get multiplied against that, and then all the gradients get multiplied against that as well, and each can have their own color. The global tint will apply a tint on top of everything. So if you have different colors in your gradients, like a blue to green or pink to blue linear gradient on top of a tinted base, the global tint will be a way to adjust the combined result together. If you adjust the base color underneath colored tints, you're going to get different results. It's going to cause different kind of shifting as the interactions are going to vary all the way up the stack. So at this stage, because there is only a simple gradient on top of a color, the global tint and the base color would have a very similar effect. But for workflow purposes, I generally work with the lowest place in the stack I can, so that I have more predictable results when I change things in between. What happens if I just go with blue on that, just out of curiosity? Again, just try stuff. No, like a better warm. Just a little bit. And again, I think this one also, it's not bad. It gives us a bit of shape, and it's creating some interesting effects over here as well. Might be a little bit much on this part here. Just take the rect light. I'm going to turn that off, actually. Take the light plane intensity. Actually, I think the rect light is turned off, so the intensity won't do anything there. Let's bring that down just a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is duplicate this again. And then bring it in front of itself. Sorry, I'm trying to find a place where you can see it. Then I'm going to scale it down and create a hot spot again like I did before. Give it just a little bit more ping. So let's take the intensity of this one right up. And then we'll take the scale right down. So have a look at this highlight here. See how that's adding some nice shape there? This could be done with messing around with the gradients, but why? This is simpler. Just trying to stretch the shape and see what I get out of that. Yeah. Yeah, I think I kind of like what's happening here. Great. So let's say for now that's good on the ring. And now I think I want to do a little bit more work on this background, add some pizzazz there. Let's grab a fresh light. Let's call this one back spot. In this case, I don't want to use the light plane. I don't want to use the shell. I do want to use spotlight. I want to take the spotlight intensity up to 1 to start. So at this stage, it's functioning almost exactly, or it is functioning exactly like an Unreal Spotlight straight out of the box. Bring that intensity up so I can see what it's doing better. Let's zero in on the spotlight controls. And let's change this one to a blue color. This is actually another example of where you can get some different things happening with colors. I chose in this case to do that color change on the spotlight color, and that's totally fine in this case because I'm only using the spotlight. But if I was using the light plane, you'll see that the color of the spotlight no longer matches the light plane. That's because the color tint, the base color tint, which you'll find under texture, gets multiplied on top of the spotlight color. Generally speaking, you want those two things to match, but if you wanted to be able to play them against each other, having control of the light colors separately is useful. In this case, if I change this to a blue, now I'm getting blue tint on the light, but that's getting added or multiplied onto the color tint that's happening on the spotlight as well. So it's getting extra blue. So if I set that back to white, just doing it with the base color instead means if I just change my mind later and I decide to switch to a rec light or a point light or add the light plane back in, any color changes I've made will carry over to those other lights. Whereas if I set everything up and use the spotlight color and then change it over to a point light, the color will need to be reset on the point light to match the spotlight. Setting it at the base texture level means they all get the same color. Generally speaking, you're going to leave the light colors alone 90% of the time, and just work with the base color and let it tint everything uniformly. Just there are a few cases, and I can show you an example of that later, where you might want a main light, or especially if you have two lights attached to an ultralight, because you can definitely do that, and I do that quite a bit. I'll create a rectangular light to create a big reflection, and then I'll add a spotlight to the same light to create a soft fill around it and change the color of that. If you go back to the demo file and look at the car example, you'll see a few cases in there where that's been done, where the main light and the rec light creating reflection and soft, cool fill. But there's a spotlight in there that's punching through the gobo to create cast shadow patterns, and it's a warm color. So it creates effective like warm window light coming through and then a bit of soft fill from a blue sky. Anyway, let us not use this. And I think the color might be a little bit too purpley. Yeah, not too bad. Now, I think in this case, the spotlight controls give me a nice bit of shaping, but it's perfectly rounded and it's sort of, it is what it is. Yeah, not too bad. Now, I think in this case, the spotlight controls give me a nice bit of shaping, but it's perfectly rounded and it's sort of, it is what it is. In this case, I think what I want to be able to do is tone down some of the light on the top and maybe even some on the front. So what I'm going to do is activate the gobo and use the gobo to carve out some of that light. By default, it's scaled to be slightly bigger than the light plane, so it's going to be massive in this case because the spotlight is actually quite small. In order to change that size, I need to select the gobo component on its own and grab the scale tool. And you'll see that its pivot point is set to one edge and it scales and rotates from there. That's just so that it, by default, it acts like a barn door. which can be handy, and in this case will be handy. So I'm going to pull that back, and then I'm going to rotate from there. I'm just going to swing that until it starts to do kind of what I want it to do. So something in that world, but right now it's got a very hard edge, even though the light's fairly soft, which I'll come back to in a sec as well, because I do want to soften that up. I don't like the little hard light that it's creating over here. But I don't want to turn off cast shadows either. Well, actually, I could try that. We can just have a quick look at what that looks like. I need to go back to the main level and turn off cast shadows for the spotlight. And it works okay in terms of getting rid of the shadows I don't like on the foreground. But then I lose that control of casting shadows from the gobo, and I can't tone down the top quite the same way. It still does something for me in terms of the indirect light, but it's not as powerful of an effect as what I'd like. So I'm going to go back and turn that on. Shadows back on, I should say. And I'm going to soften up the spotlight shadows quite a bit and make them just less obvious. They're still there, but more subtle. What I'm going to do with the gobo to further soften that edge up is add a linear gradient to it. We just need to figure out where that gradient actually is and what edge it's affecting. So it's actually not the axis that I'm looking for in this case. It could be rotated, or I could use the X rotation and turn it into whatever direction I want, but I'll just use this one because it's already there. So I'm dropping the softness contrast back, and that's creating a much softer edge to that gobo, as you can see. So if I go back to the spotlight just for a sec and reset this, so we've got hard edges again. So we've got hard edge shadow here, but you can see how much softer the gobo shadow is now. Back to the gobo. Turn this off. So there. And that's all coming from that soft edge gobo. There, we bring it down in and then soften it out. Still feeling a little bit of that hard edge there. So I think what we'll do is take up the contrast in this just a little bit to fade that edge a bit more. There we go. Take the gobo and move it down just a little bit more. There. Bit of a long way to get there, but I think that works pretty nicely. There are a number of ways you could do this. One of the things that I also, what I like to do when the camera is fixed, is to use the gobo in a similar manner, but putting it right in front of the camera and using it as an ND filter or a gradient on the camera itself. So let me show you that with the foreground, for example. So let's grab a new light. And in this case, we're going to use the gobo and nothing else. So this is now just a gobo, once I turn off the shell anyway. So it's just a black plane. And again, you can do this with other geometry, but the advantage of having it in the UltraLight is you can turn this into a light, you can turn it into a reflector, you can do whatever you want with it or mix and match. Oops, off key. Let's go with linear gradients on the gobo. And let's take the contrast of that way down to soften it up. Let's put that just in front of the camera. can already see what it's doing. Combining the depth of field, let's just make this really obvious so I can see it there. Combining depth of field to knock it out of focus and using the softness of the gobo itself, you can create a vignette, a linear vignette. Oops. Which can also be done in post, of course, but there is a difference sometimes in the way the high dynamic range is affected. So I kind of like doing it in camera. This can be locked to the camera to create like a post process to sort of effect. But for stills, which is mostly what I do, this sort of quick way of toning down the shot, or even just, effectively toning down the foreground, can be really handy. And I don't necessarily need to mess with my lights at all. It's just attached to the camera, so it's literally just shooting through it and causing some darkening in that foreground area. And if I think it's a little bit strong, I can just take the overall opacity of the whole thing, of the whole gobo down, and effectively like knocking stops off an ND filter, a graduated ND filter. So I think we could probably stop here on this one for now. Let's just have a quick look and see what else is happening with that spotlight. Notice here, my gobo is impacting my lighting. It's creating that dark spot here. So while it's doing some stuff for me that I like, it's actually impacting my lighting, which I hadn't noticed up until now. So there's a few ways to deal with that. In reality, you would have to find a better position for both. In CG land, I would probably just do 2 passes and render this one for the ring and this one for the overall, and then just match that piece in. There's, again, lots of different ways you can deal with it. We can try, though, quickly to see if there's a way to get that gobo to not impact that light quite as much. But it's iffy because of where everything has to be. See, I can bring that inside that light, but it changes a lot of things. So I think I'll probably just leave it where it is and then render them as 2 separate passes. So again, taking that top light, the back spotlight, taking it off, turning it off, rendering it that way, and then adding it back in. Just coming back to this, I think there is something I do want to change actually, and that's just this background is a little bit flat, a little bit blah. So I think I'm going to take that back spot and duplicate it and tighten up the spread on that a little bit. Again, the spotlight controls have been replicated at the blueprint level, so we can get at everything from one place without having to dive in and grab these separate components. But the full range of controls for the spotlights and all the lights when they're activated are available at the component level. Anything that's being driven at the blueprint level, you won't be able to override from down here. For example, if I change the intensity, it's going to reset itself because the blueprint level is driving that intensity. But anything that isn't, so anything that I have not exposed at the blueprint level, can be controlled from the component level. It just makes it a little easier when you're doing stuff like this. I just want to tighten that up. I think I'm going to turn the gobo off from that one, because I don't want any extra shadows cast. What I'm trying to do is just create a little bit more of a hot spot on the ground here, just to brighten that area up a little bit. Obviously this is kind of intense, but just want to be able to see it. Still a bit big. Like the color. A bit more tint to that one. Yeah, I think that's better. And let's just take the intensity way down. Just a bit more separation. Get a feel of that distance. That's a little too much hard edge. Let's just deselect so we don't get that interference on the screen. So that's without, that's with. Not a huge jump, but I like it better. So I think I will leave it there. Actually, just for laughs, let's compare it to what I did the first time around. Let's take all of these lights and add them to my lighting 2 folder. Quite different, very different feel. Yeah, I mean, there's things I like about both. I do like the amount of dark that's still happening in this one here. I think maybe that's a little bit better. A little more black reflecting in the gold helps bring out the shape. This one might be just a tad overlaid in this side. And, you know, there's a few ways to get around that, especially actually if I turn that extra spotlight off. Which one was that, the back spot? This one here. You can add some black cards in there to create dark reflections to carve in the shape in front of the lights rather than reposition or rebuild all the lighting. It's really just a preferential thing, and working with your client, you'll decide what works best and what doesn't. I still kind of like this first one, but, you know, again, it's a subjective thing. The main point was to just demonstrate how simple lighting can be made more complex using the tools that are built into UltraLight. And it can happen really fast. Like this whole thing could have been done in 10 minutes if I wasn't kind of trying to walk my way through it and explain it. So yeah, hit me up if you have any questions or any input. I'd also love to start looking at your files if you want to do some lighting sessions. You know, send me your file and we can go through how I would light it and how I would use the UltraLight to do so. And yeah, feel free to reach out, make a comment down below, or send me an email. Thanks. Just wanted to come back and talk a little bit about the various color controls on the lights. The example that I mentioned from the demo level is here. So what we have here is a UltraLight setup using the spotlight and a rec light and the gobo and 3 different colors. And we can kind of walk our way through what that's all about. So the spotlight is shining through the gobo to create the cast pattern of the window. And that's just using the gradient maps on the gobo. No texture, as you can see. It could be done with a texture too, but it was just faster in this case for me to make it using the gradients and the repetition lines. It's a little bit of softening just to create some more interesting shape. A little less obvious when you're looking at it this way, but you can see it here. There's the softer edges coming from the softer gradients. But also in part from the softness of the shadow cast by the spotlight. Which if I make that fully sharp, they look like that. And the sharpness of the shadow is going to be controlled partly from the sharpness of the texture, partly from the sharpness of the shadow on the spotlight, but also by the distance of the gobo to the light source itself. So if we move that further away, it's going to get sharper, and if we move it closer to the light, it's going to get softer. Just like you would in reality. You've got some room to play there. So by pulling it back and then playing with the scale, you can kind of control that separately. The point of the color thing that I wanted to make here, though, if we go back up to the blueprint level, always a bit of a tongue twister for me, you see I've got color set on the base, which is affecting the spotlight and the light plane. And then there's a global tint being applied over top of that, which is just adding some extra warmth. If I reset that, you can see that there. We go down, though, and look at the rec light. You'll see I've got blue on the rec light. And if I activate that again, what I'm doing with this is creating some fill and softening those dark shadows. So I'm creating the illusion of having multiple lights in the scene with just one light. And I can play around with the intensity of that, have more or less fill. And because the blue light is being affected a little bit by the base color yellow, it's not a super strong blue. But if I reset this, you'll see. Oops, I lost my light there. There, you can see the difference in the color there. So I can create a cool fill that's interacting with the warm light of the spotlight, and then the tint overall is just a way of controlling sort of the overall feel, combined warmth of the base color, which is affecting the spotlight, and the blue, which is affecting the rect light. And if there was a light plane, this would be affecting that as well. Anyway, that was the example that I wanted to show you guys, just to show how the different color levels interact. Again, the spotlight could also be given some extra color, and you'll notice that it gets darker. If you work with a contrasting color compared to what it's projecting or being multiplied on top of it, it will effectively get darker. You can see you've got quite an incredible range of control between the different levels of color, between the lights, the multiple lights interacting, the global tint on top of everything.